All right, hey everybody, and welcome to our third Facebook Live workshop. This one entitled "Help! I Need to Write a Paper." I'm Chase.
I'm Atia.
And we're going to walk you kind of like through a step-by-step process to make sure you're ready for writing your next paper, because we know finals are coming up and you're going to have to write one. The first and most important thing you can remember when you're writing a paper is the amount of time you have to write that paper, because making sure you have enough time to get something done is super important, because the last thing you want to do is end up the day it's due and not have anything to turn in. A general rule of thumb is you want to make sure you have the paper done at least a week ahead of time. Why would you want it done a week ahead of time?
You want to wait, you don't want to wait too long to ask your professor a question. You want to give it at least 2 days, 2 class periods at least, to ask your professor any questions that you need for the paper, any help,
Right. Yeah. You always want to make sure you have the option to have some feedback on your paper before you turn it in, so you don't turn in something that isn't so great because you didn't leave yourself enough time to ask questions. All right. So with that in mind, let's talk about the next thing you need to worry about, and that is the assignment itself, because you can't really write the paper unless you understand what you're writing about in the first place. So we're going to talk about a handy-dandy little example. In this example, you have been tasked with choosing a important person in the field of education, and picking one of them and writing about how their works helped education, where they came from, and their influence on education today. So the first thing you need to understand is you need to know that if your professor says it in the rubric, and the rubric is that little piece of paper they give you the day that the little piece of paper they give you that describes what the paper is about. If it's on the rubric, you're going to want to answer it in the paper.
yes. If your professor specifically says it, you want to do that point.
Yeah. If your professor is straight up telling you what they want, giving them what they want is a surefire way to end up with a good grade. Another thing to think about is the brainstorming and research phase. So in our example, we're choosing educators to talk about. So the first thing I would do is look at the list of people I can choose from to talk about. And so I know that when I'm deciding, the first thing I do is kind of pick names that just sound interesting. I know that doesn't sound very scholarly, but it's a good way to at least get started. So I'll pick 2 or 3 names, and then I'll Google what these people are about, and I'll try to pick the person that sounds most interesting. And that, believe it or not, actually counts as at least a little bit of research.
Personally, I just listen in class and try to pick someone that my teacher talks about and that I find interesting in class, so I don't do any research beforehand. I just pick someone I see in class that I feel like I can get the most information out of.
Right, and that's also a good way to do it, because if the professor's talking about them in class, they're obviously important to what you're doing. So the next step is, okay, I know who I'm writing about. I know the question I'm going to answer in my paper because my professor is asking me about them. How do I brainstorm where I'm going to go with my paper? And that one's a bit tougher because it really varies from person to person. Some people like to make outlines. You've seen those before, where you write your thesis at the top of the paper, and then you go down and say, and I'm going to break it down, I'm going to answer this question in this paragraph, and this one in this paragraph, and this one in this paragraph. And that works for some people. Some people do the method we probably all learned back in elementary and middle school, where we make the little web and have the little things that branch out from it. Personally, my way is to just kind of start working on kind of a rough draft, and then as I'm writing, I think, you know what, I need more information here or here or here, and I use that to build where my paper's eventually going to end up in later drafts. Yeah. Right, how do you kind
I
of
do that same
start that?
thing where I look at what this professor wants and I just start writing whatever I need to write and then add information later on.
Yeah, you'll be surprised about how much information you can learn just by writing stuff down and realizing what's missing. So you've got your ideas down. You're starting to figure out how to brainstorm at least the direction your paper's taking. But it's a research paper, so you need information. And so at this point is when you have to get down and dirty open up your laptop, go to the library, figure out the information you need to make sure this paper is fantastic. So there are several resources you have as a Lander student. One, is Google. Everyone has it. It's very basic. You're probably not going to get a lot of scholarly results there, but you'll get at least a lot of basic information. There's also Google Scholar, but we also, here at Lander, we do have access to Lander's databases, which is going to have a lot of very scholarly, peer-reviewed things that will make sure your paper is well sourced.
You can also make an appointment with Rebecca Scoggins in the library consultant. She can help you with a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and you can just go to the library's website, and there's actually should be an option on the website that says Book a Librarian, and she'll help you kind of walk through the research process and find good sources for your paper. So at this point in your kind of process, you figure out what your professor wants, you brainstorm where you're going, you know what time it's due, and you've got your information. But now the question is, when do you get that information that goes into your paper? When do you research? Do you research right at the beginning during the brainstorming phase? Do you wait until after, like we talked about, having a draft ready and then going back in and adding information that you need in? Mm-hmm. That's a matter of personal taste, personal preference. Like I said, when people brainstorm, a lot of them outline after they research so that they know where the information they need goes into the paper. Some people write their paper and then look at it and say, okay, this paragraph sounds good, but I don't have enough evidence or anything to back up what I'm saying. So this is where I probably need to go in and add a lot of that research in.
I feel like that helps a lot with plagiarism too, because then you do the research after, and you're not adding information that you think is your own into the paper after reading whatever research you did.
Yeah, and that's a very good point to make, because that's one thing you want to avoid with research, is make sure that you have ideas that exist outside of the research. Make sure you do something with the research. Don't just reiterate it. So you have your sources, you have your idea, you know where your paper's going, your own time, you're ready to go. So how do you start writing? So this one is where it starts to get a little bit different. You can just take that out. If you've built a good outline, a lot of the times you can just take those ideas and start building sentences out of them and then go back in and fill it in, and before you know it, you have the bones of a pretty decent essay. You can do it like the way we talked about, where we kind of build a rough draft that very bare bones, go back in, add our research in, add a couple supplementary sentences, and then we have a good rough draft of an essay that we'll then go back and refine grammar and all that kind of stuff. But the key to making sure you have a good paper is making sure that you have some form of plan going into it. The last thing you want to do is write a rough draft that becomes your final draft because you didn't give yourself enough time. And so we've also included a couple things on the board, some like kind of 3 quick questions you always want to ask yourself at the beginning of every paper assignment you get. So the first question, we kind of already covered this, is does your professor tell you what they want in the rubric? And I cannot stress this enough, but if your professor specifically asks for it in the rubric or the piece of paper they give you, make sure you answer that in your paper, because obviously that's what your professor is looking for. You can add more, but you make sure if your professor says it, at least that much is in that paper.
A few other things you want to look for when you get your rubric is the length of the paper, the type of research, APA, MLA, Chicago. Topics.
Yeah, the citation thing is also super important, or formatting in general. We've actually included that here as one of our other questions. Is like, what formatting style does your professor want? So if your professor says APA, you can either go ahead and get your paper set up in APA before you start writing it, or you can just get your ideas down and go back and format it later. But whatever one you do, just make sure that if your professor asks for APA, they get APA. If they ask for MLA, they get MLA. And if they ask for Chicago, they get Chicago. Science has a couple other forms of citation that you might be using in your paper, but APA and MLA tend to be the most popular forms at Lander. And then we just talked about this one at length, but how do you do research and how much do you need? And that's something that I guess we haven't really talked about much, is how much research do you do? And that's kind of a tough question. You want to make sure that you have enough research that it builds your paper and gives it support, but you don't want to do so much research that your paper is just regurgitating what you read online. A good way to think of research is like the foundation of a house. It's great, it's there, it supports the house, but no one wants to look at a foundation. And going back to citations and formatting style for just one more second, if you guys need any help with like MLA, APA, anything like that, one, you can come down to the Writing Center because that's what we're good at helping with. But also, our next workshop that we're doing is actually going to be on APA formatting. So if you guys have any questions about that, that one's going to be right before exams. So I know that that's going to be helpful to probably a lot of you. Right? And so, like in previous Facebook Live events or workshops, feel free to ask questions in the comments. We'll try to answer those. If you type in the next minute or two, we might answer it on air. If not, we'll try to answer it in the comments later. Good.
Good job, guys. Whoops.